Welcome everybody to this occasion to celebrate the life of Keith Faulkner, who I think everybody here in all their different ways got to know so well. And I think it does say an enormous amount really about Keith's work and his life. Quite how many people are here from quite so many different areas of activity. Some of you, I think, may have known Keith since his student days at Guildford College of Art. Others met him when he worked for the National Union of Students. Of course, there are a great many of his colleagues from the TUC staff, past and present. And many of you got to know Keith through his work for the TUC, whether through print buying, conference organisation, or through the demonstrations and events that became his specialist subject. And I think he did quite well on Mastermind if he'd had the chance to be tested out in that way. I'm very pleased as well to welcome members of the 1803 Club that are here in force. They're the group that regularly shared the same table on the train from Charing Cross to Hastings, where Keith... We've heard about the drinks round, you know, people say, where are the drinks? And then if they weren't there, they'd say, where's Keith? Where's Keith? Because Keith, I think, was the honorary table master. And it's great that there are so many other of Keith's friends from Hastings, from the Pizarro, his local, and those involved as well in, I think, the Wine and Seafood Festival that Keith helped to organise. A number of colleagues indicating that was how they got to know Keith. And perhaps most important of all, of course, we have members of Keith's family here. His brother Mike, his former wife Chris, their sons Owen and Ryan, and Chris's partner Tom. And delighted that you're all with us for this evening. We thought it would be good this evening just to spend a short time trying to put together all of those different aspects of Keith's life and to make sense of how the Keith that each of us got to know perhaps fitted into the other parts of his life. So Nigel Stanley, the head of the TUC's Campaign and Communications Department, has the task of trying to take us through Keith's story. Nigel has been Keith's line manager for... There was a period when I was always also Keith's line manager, but I managed to move on to other things. But before I ask Nigel really to take up the story, can we first of all watch what I can only describe as some rare video footage.
Start spreading the news.
You may wonder why the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, but as we've been able to discover, Keith was in fact a direct descendant of the Roman sea god Neptune. It's why he was inexorably drawn to Hastings. Of course, it's customary at events like this to say something like it's what he would have wanted. But with Keith, that's absolutely not the case. Because if there's one thing we knew about Keith was he hated being the centre of attention. He always arranged it for other people to be the centre of occasion and took quite pride in making that happen. I can also say that some of you have still got ties on as well, and I can tell you that's absolutely not what Keith would have wanted. What we do know about Keith is that he was notoriously camera shy. You try and take a picture, and this is what you generally got. But thanks to his friends, his family, and the two Mikes who've helped put together this tonight, we do have, I think, quite a gallery of pictures. And I'm going to try to tell his life story through that. Keith always told us that he was a tough, no-nonsense northerner, kind of made out of nails and rock. Nothing soft about Keith. Perhaps he didn't like it up north and had to come south, but he did have a bit of a problem with cultural shock. Because he was still kept wearing his flat cap even after he'd moved south. Now, Keith left school when he was 15. He joined the National Graphical Association when he became an apprentice compositor. And perhaps younger people might like to look compositor up in Wikipedia to find out what it was. Keith went straight into conflict with authority. His foreman suggested that it might be time that Keith visited the Barbers for a trim. As you can see, his hair was outrageously long by this time. This was Keith's story. In fact, looking at this picture, we're wondering, in fact, whether it was his refusal to join the Brill Cream-sponsored Buddy Holly lookalike competition that actually got him into trouble. But as I think you all know, Keith never again appeared in public, or at least for 3 decades, without a decent covering of flowing hair covering his shoulders. That only ended when he started to wear a ponytail. And I remember the look he gave me when I suggested it might be because it had become fashionable. It's about this time as well that Keith got his first motorbike and became a prominent member of the Godalming Bikers. Now, I must say, for a motorcycle gang, the Godalming Bikers doesn't sound that terrifying, but... And I think we can imagine what it was like if Keith had anything to do with running it. It would have looked very fierce and would have had a very complicated rule book, which Keith would have drawn up and rigorously enforced. But that's always been one of Keith's real contradictions, really. One, why he was such a rich and complex person. Because he was a natural rebel. He had almost no respect for authority, certainly none for mine. But he always had a set of rules, and he insisted that you obeyed them too. So, after serving his apprenticeship, he actually went off to Reading University and became a student. And then, after working on a construction site, he came into his, I think, life's work with his first proper job, perhaps we can say, at the National Union of Students. He was politically very committed, and he played a big role in the Grunwick demonstrations at the time, which is where he met Micheal, who's supplied us with many of these early photos today. And here's a picture from that collection with Jaya Ben Desai at the front there. And to tell you more about that period in Keith's life is Francis Becket, who's now a quite well-known author, but at that time was Keith's head of department at NUS, and a founder member with myself of the Keith Line Managers Support Network.
Yes, well, thank you, Nigel. I just want to tell you that when I was Keith's line manager, Keith knew who the boss was. He never told me who it was, but I felt fairly sure he did know. It was my idea to bring him into NUS. We got our publications into a bit of a mess for various reasons, which I wouldn't dream of telling you about. And I thought we've got to have somebody who can really sort this mess out. And Keith had done he'd been a freelance graphic designer. He'd done a lot of freelance work for us. And I'd grown to like him and admire him. And I brought him in and asked him to sort this lot out. And he came in and he sorted it out. And he really did sort it out very quickly. It was like a steam train piling through this self-indulgent mess that we had around us. Now, how did he achieve that? Was it by the way most people succeed, where people are supposed to succeed, by loads and loads of flattery and charm? Well, no, that wasn't actually how he did it. That wasn't what Keith did, really. The only other way you can do something like that is by being really good at what you do and working ferociously hard. And that's how Keith did it. And that was, and just watching him do that, and watching him take control of the thing, and, you know, where there was opposition, piling his way through it, and people would let him, not because he'd managed to persuade them how right he was, but because he was pretty well an unstoppable force. I think he always had his own names, and I'm never sure whether this happened at the TUC. He always used to call me Scoop for some reason. I was the press officer. I spent a lot of my time talking to journalists and writing press releases. So Keith, on his first day there, decided that my name was Scoop. And ever afterwards, right to the end of his life, he called me Scoop. And on November the 1st last year, and you'll remember this, Nigel, I had to come and see you over something that we both remember and won't talk about. And I knocked at the door of your department, and it was locked, and Keith saw me there, and he came, and it was November the 1st last year, and he came and he flung open the door and he said, "Hello, Scoop." and I had no idea then that I'd never see him again. And now I'll always think of him standing behind that door, standing in front of that door, and I can see him as I speak to you now, standing there and saying, "Hello, Scoop." As for the department that he and I were both part of, which was supposed to be called the Press and Publications Department, but Keith decided that its proper name was the Propaganda Collective. I never knew why he decided. Well, I know partly why he decided that, because he thought it would irritate the then NUS executive, who kind of I'm trying not to say Stalinist, but Keith would have said Stalinist, who he knew instinctively wouldn't have approved of it being called the Propaganda Collective. And that, I think, is why he went around. I'm never sure, you never ask Keith those things. Why do you do this? He just did it. That's how he was. And having decided it was called the Propaganda Collective, he decided that was far too long to say every day, so he always referred to it as Propcol. And you call a departmental meeting, you didn't need to tell anybody. Keith would wander around the building saying, "Got a meeting at Propcol this afternoon." I made a mistake about Keith then. I thought that what he wanted to do with his life was be a graphic designer. What he wanted to do with his life was to serve the labour movement in any way that he possibly could. And at that time, the best way he could do it was using his considerable talent as a graphic designer. I remember him, and I'll finish with this, I remember him as a workaholic. I remember him drinking vast quantities of Guinness and never seeming to be affected by it. I remember him eating curries that were so hot that they would take the top of the roof of your mouth off. Most of all, I remember him with admiration and respect and affection. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francis. Well, after Keith left the NUS in 1978, he came here to the TUC. And those who were at the funeral would have heard Brendan's tribute to his improvisation abilities with the photocopying at the first TUC Congress he went to, demonstrating his calm and confident and constructive approach to any crisis, something that we all remember and to which there were never any exceptions, except when they involved his computer, which was frequently almost thrown out of the window. Though it is also worth remembering that he never ever put paper in the photocopier on the grounds that that was a natty job. That's an obscure print union joke for those who don't get it, but I know some of you will have enjoyed that one. Keith came to the TUC at the time. Oh, there's a picture of Keith when, I think that's probably taken when Francis was pointing him in the vague general direction of what needed doing. But he came to the TUC at what became known as the Winter of Discontent. Now, Keith didn't cause the Winter of Discontent, though he certainly knew something about uncollecting the rubbish around his desk. But it did produce a Conservative government. Very bad news for the people of this country, but it did produce lots of big campaigns and huge demonstrations. And that was when Keith really came into his element. And here's a few reminders of what he got up to, particularly on the graphic design front. No pastel colours for Keith. That's Trafalgar Square, and there's Clive Jenkins modelling a tabard, an early sighting of a demonstration tabard there. Len Murray looking particularly pleased to be there, I think. In fact, they all look like as if they're particularly pleased to be there. But Keith got them there anyway. Another of Keith's posters. Again, very typical, very clear, no serif typefaces either. Some of the badges that we did. Jobs Express. And the NHS. Now, although Keith was the great demonstration organiser, it has to be said that things were a bit primitive in those days. Here's a 1982 NHS dispute with TUC staff attempting to hold together a banner on the back of a lorry in Hyde Park. Not much concern for risk assessments, one suspects, in those days. Keith's keeping well out of the way of that one. Just doing a bit of gentle supervision, I think. The 1983 People's March for Job was another great Keith occasion and produced rather a lot of memorabilia. The poster and the logo, which I suspect some of you remember. We've always been very good at recycling in the TUC. Indeed, Keith left us a huge storm of material that might just come into use again one day, if we could ever open the door and actually get in there. But as an early constructive use of recycling, it's here as not only recycling, but football sponsorship. Yes, there's quite a few people in that picture for whom it might not be appropriate to say, "You haven't changed a bit, have you?" Now, Congress stage sets were a bit more primitive in those days too, and Mike Smith tells me about the 1980 TUC Congress when unemployment had hit 2 million. Keith and his colleague Jonathan Stevenson, who's here tonight, had the job of taking a carpet-like banner to Brighton by train. too long to get into a taxi, and so the two of them had to carry it on their shoulders the mile or so from Brighton Station. It's not a mile or so, Mike, it's less than a mile, but it's quite a long walk in the pouring rain. Not on the route I go anyway, perhaps they found a different one. But their arrival coincided with a particularly heavy rainstorm, and they arrived at the hotel in a rather bedraggled state. And there they were greeted by Norman Willis, then Deputy General Secretary, with the words, here come the men responsible for our public image. I gather Keith was not very pleased with this, but for once showed admirable self-restraint. I think one of the things that we'll always remember Keith for was the fact that he always had to drive the van. Now, over his many years, he's had many means of transport. There were the terrifying days with the Godalming leather-coated thugs that terrorised the mean streets of Surrey. Apparently had a Mini when he was at the NUS. I find this hard to believe. And he apparently later had a rather flash Granada. But Keith was really never at home unless he was behind the wheel of a van or preferably a lorry. He'd always transport the materials himself to a NUS conference, although this was interrupted briefly by an exercise where he had to blow into a plastic bag along the Euston Road. But it continued with the Jobs Express. We've seen the picture for that. Now, that went by train, but Keith drove a van instead with the sleeping bags and the placards, etc. And he also loved taking the van to the Cheltenham for the annual GCHQ rallies that we maintained all those years when they were not allowed to join a union. And here's a couple of photos of the GCHQ people who were sacked for belonging to a union. No, that's not meant to happen yet. Now, in his spare time, because Keith liked driving vans so much, if you wanted to move house, Keith would do it for you. And being Keith, he always knew exactly what size of van to hire. And it was always absolutely jam full, but you still got everything in. Keith was, in fact, in many ways, the trade union's own white van man. And, of course, one of the things he did was go around the country setting up our equality conferences. That was a cause that Keith really believed in and was really close to his heart. And to say a few words about how Keith supported the equality conferences, I'd like to welcome Sarah Veale, the head of our Employment and Equal Rights Department.
It's almost impossible ever to follow Nigel, but I will try. This is really on behalf of the Equality and Employment Rights Department. I wanted to say a few words in tribute to Keith, because although it's a very well-worn cliche, Keith really was absolutely, literally invaluable to us in organising what was always quite a challenging set of conferences. He was the glue that held every conference together on every occasion. I remember my very first women's conference in this job. I was absolutely terrified. Kay had said to me, "It's okay when you get down there, everything will be looked after by Keith." So all the way down there on the train, I was saying, I've got to find Keith, and everything will be all right. So I turned up at the Eastbourne Conference Centre, and I walked in the front doors, and I saw Steph Pugsley, and I said, "Steph, where's Keith? Where's Keith?" And Steph said to me, "He's in his office." And I said, "Oh, that'll be at the back of the stage, the office." And she said, "No." She pointed, she said, "Out there." So I looked out there, out of the window, and there was the Duke of Marlborough. Not in person, but a public house. She said, "If you want Keith, go and have a look in there." So I thought, oh my God. And I went into the aforementioned tavern, and there, sitting in a very nice sort of comfortable place with a huge table, was Keith with a great big glass of this black fuel that seemed to keep him going throughout all these various trials and tribulations. and spread out in front of him was the seating plan for the women's conference. So I thought, well, he does look as though he's in control of that, but I better intervene and be a bit like a head of department. I was very new at it all then. So very, very rashly, I said to Keith, I said, why haven't you put the education unions together? And he went, come on. He said, do you want the conference to run smoothly or not? So, which was very good advice, as it turned out. They were made to go to separate corners of the conference hall, and that was the best way to have done it. He was also, I quite agree, that Keith was more or less incapable of doing a risk assessment, which might explain how he managed to think he could get away with walking into the Women's Committee and going, hello, girls. And but any other man, I think, would have been, well, just don't think about it, don't go there. But not Keith. They all fell in love with Keith. And at the women's conferences, regularly, women had come up shyly onto the platform with carrier bags and say, can you give this to Keith? He helped us do this, and this. And it was usually cans of Guinness, the occasional whiskey bottle. But they absolutely adored him, and I think that was a one-off. I don't think anyone else would ever get that kind of respect, because they knew that although I wouldn't call Keith someone who is over-bothered by political correctness, they knew that Keith actually was deeply committed to equality and to all the the work that the committees and the conferences were doing. And he'd hate me for saying this, I think, but Keith actually, and he was very modest, I think was probably the foremost expert in the UK about organising disabled, accessible conferences. And he swore a lot. He didn't do it sort of singing with joy. And the language was absolutely unbelievable from me, let alone him. But he knew all about all those things, loops, this, that, and the other, that you have to get right. And it wasn't just one or two people. For a disabled workers' conference, you've got just about every possible type of access problem, and they worked fantastically. They were difficult at the beginning. He was always calm, but we got there. And I think if Keith had wanted to, he could have sold his services on to anyone who wanted to organise one of those sort of conferences. He was fantastic. He was a great person to work in as part of a team. If you went out to these various shuddery seaside places that we used to hold the equality conferences, any restaurant that you walked into, Keith would recommend, let's go and have a ruby, which I was told meant a curry. And you'd walk into anywhere and Keith would go, hello Keith, mate, how are you? Have a bottle of wine on the house. He knew just about everybody in every seaside town as far as I could work out. And that was great for keeping the whole thing going, actually, and keeping the staff team sane, which is important in those things. So I don't think you need any more from me. You want to hear more of Nigel's witticisms and see the photos, which I'm certainly enjoying very much. But I do just want to say, really, with enormous, feeling from my heart, actually, that I dread to think how we're going to do these conferences without Keith. It's taken already, for this women's conference coming up, it has honestly taken us 10 different people to try and do the massive amount of work that Keith did, and that's just on one conference. So we're all going to miss him absolutely massively. But thank you very much, Keith, for making them all work so wonderfully. What a star. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly true that we're very worried about the future viability of the Coptic Street branch of Pizza Express, because without Keith's custom, I very much wonder whether they're still commercially viable. And the red wine deliveries have just been mounting up in the street. In the 1980s, Keith moved from Tottenham to Hastings after marrying Chris. Now, most people would find those long commutes by train a bit of a challenge. Indeed, I think everyone in our office became great experts on all the possible causes of delay in the trains between Hastings and London, and I can tell you there are quite a lot of those. But this was simply an organisational challenge for Keith, and before long, we had the 1803 Club with Keith as table master that Brendan's already talked about. And again, we knew phrases like Honourable Thursday, quite Honorary Thursday, rather quickly in our department. But to tell you a bit more about the club and Keith's contribution is Micheal Whittingdale. Micheal.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm the serious part of the evening, I think, after that. First of all, I want to thank Alan Mathewson for getting in touch with us and Mike Smith for inviting us here tonight. Next, I want to say a word to Ryan and Owen, and that is that you can judge a man by the company he keeps. And if you look around you tonight, you can see your dad was great. And also, the test of true friendship is somebody you can turn your back on who frankly won't crap on you. And Keith never would. Next, I'd like to introduce you to one or two members of the 1803 Club who've been brave enough to risk my lies. First of all, Dave Goodchild, who's known to Keith affectionately as the Babe Magnet. He's also gave Banksy an idea or two when he splashed Dave's big gusset on a building wall between Waterloo East and London Bridge. Actually, tonight, Dave, is the night for you to reveal Dave's big gusset because nobody else knows where it is. Next, a lady called Antonia who has discovered a bug. And the proper name of the bug is Fusobacterium necrophorum. And it's a kind of flu, isn't it? And also, Antonia is an itinerant drummer and a firelighter. You like bonfires? Now, before I move on, I just want to introduce you to Ruby, whose real name is Ailsa. We're not quite sure why she's called Ruby. It may be that she loses huge amounts of fake blood when she draws things for, what's the place called? The Chamber of Horrors and London Dungeon. Tableau is the word I'm looking for. Next, I want to say that although we're here to celebrate, for the last month or two, we haven't actually felt much like celebrating. As when we get to Charing Cross Station, we're reminded of our loss because Keith isn't seen standing on the platform in his normal position. Usually he'd be there at least 10 minutes before the train arrived, standing quietly, either doing the Evening Standard or Sudoku. He'd chosen two special spots. They were precise points at which the front set of the doors of carriage 8 would open. He could then be sure of being the first onto the train, obviously after the incoming passengers had got off. Normally. Keith could also sense when the train was coming before anyone else could. He said that this was because he could feel the vibes by putting his hand out over the track. But actually, as he mostly stood with his back to the track, he probably felt the vibes first somewhere else. Once on the train, Keith moved quickly to his favourite seat, but then would spend ages blocking the gangway whilst putting his things on the rack and generally sorting himself out. On Thursdays, before sitting down, Keith would extract a number of paper cups and his Corcus screwus from his briefcase. He'd then have a goodie bag containing a bottle of red wine and an assortment of crisps, nuts, cheese straws, wafers, Welsh tea cakes, and his favourite fiery dip. These he would generously share with his friends on top table. And he'd also offer wine to those lucky enough to be sitting nearby, usually with the words, "Would you like a drop of wine?" This is certainly how I met him some 5 or 6 years ago. Keith must have been doing this journey for almost 20 years, even longer possibly, I don't know. But the journey time between London and Hastings is supposed to be 1 hour and 40 minutes, but actually takes about 20 minutes longer. So Keith spent the best part of 4 hours on the train every day. That's 20 hours a week, 80 a month, and 960 a year. So if he'd been doing it for 18 years, you probably can work out that that's almost 2 full years of time. No wonder he couldn't stand badly behaved children, or mulers, as he called them. He couldn't stand over chatty old ladies either. If misbehaving children came within range, he would look at them and growl, and they would shut up. But this didn't work so well with chatty old ladies, who of course never shut up. Keith's top table began many, many years before I came on the scene. It started in the days of slam door carriages, when I'm told that top table was a wallpaper table set in the middle of a compartment taken over by Keith and his friends. They dined together in some style, generally with a candelabra in the centre. Somehow they managed to keep the compartment to themselves by wedging the windows shut with bits of paper and locking the door to the corridor with a key that one of them, possibly called Dave, had mysteriously acquired from somewhere. They were the Faulkner originals, one or two of whom I've been lucky enough to meet. Keith was the undisputed event organiser and master of ceremonies, although, as with everything else, he went about this quietly and without fuss. And I'm going to read to you from his soda bread report in respect of the seafood and white wine evening on the 11th of November last. It's an email, Keith to all. OK, folks, everything's sorted. Smoked salmon, sorted. Sancerre, sorted. There are likely to be 7 of us, maybe 8, so suggest 3 bottles. Bread, I'll get 2 loaves of sliced granary. Butter, I'll get a small slab. Lemons, I will get. Prawns, I will look for something suitable. We need to sort out money tonight, but likely to be between £5 and £10 each. See you all then. The next day after the event, he wrote, "It seems that everyone enjoyed last night. Need to think about the next one and pre-Christmas late lunch. David and I have sorted out the finances, so here's the fallout, which he went through. For simplicity, I'll collect £10 each from Ailsa and Tony. How does that sound? P.S. I'm going to be on the 1719 tonight." Unfortunately, we never did have our pre-Christmas event at the Micheal as we'd done in 2009, although he did pop into the Harp for a quick, cool Guinness on the 9th before he went off to meet some friends from the Met, presumably to talk about next month's March. Keith and I then shared a bottle of Valpolicella on the way home on the 10th. He was tired that evening and didn't wave goodbye as he usually did. Since then, as you can well imagine, going home on the train has been a much gloomier affair. No more Faulkner Thursdays, no substitute Thursdays on other days when somebody else produces the wine, no games, no pointing at the sides of the queue waiting outside the corner building between Waterloo East and London Bridge, where, according to Keith, a profession much older than mine was carried on. Even Dave's big gusset has gone. Everything is different, except the train time, which is still 2 hours. Keith wasn't really one for making a fuss, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to be remembered for anything else except being good company. So we've decided to reinstitute Faulkner Thursdays with effect from next Thursday of next week. And we're going to meet at the Harp at 5 o'clock, and needless to say, you're all invited. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. I think I can say that it wasn't only small children that got that look. I've had it once or twice too, and I knew what to do. I think one of the things that always surprised us at the TUC, because Keith always seemed to be working here. He's been known to stay the night in our meeting room in our office, but that he was such an active member of the local community in Hastings. He was very well known in his local, the Pizarro. There are 2 theories about why he chose the Pizarro for his local. One is because of his interest in art and the late 19th century French Impressionists in particular. And the other was because of his interest in art and the late 19th century French Impressionists in particular. Here's a picture from the Pizarro. That's Keith's particular glass. I think we all know what went in it, and in fact it's an unusual picture, in fact, as it's empty at the time. But we're very pleased to welcome Stephen Potter from Hastings Borough Council, where he's the Sector Development Officer for Tourism, Retail and Leisure. You have the same kind of long job titles that we do in the TUC, but Stephen, come and tell us about Hastings.
Dreadful job titles, aren't they? Awful. It's not quite right, but it doesn't matter. It'll change next month, probably. I'm reminded, actually, that I first met Keith. I've lived in Hastings all my life. I first met Keith because I've got two sons with my partner, Ellie, who are just a couple of years younger than Keith's boys. And I used to go on Saturday mornings and one on the back and pushing one in a trolley and get some fish from the Old Town, which turned out to be where eventually the Seafood and Wine Festival would take place. And I remember bumping into Keith a few times, coming back, because he'd been down to the RNLI with his boys to watch the boats. They do this thing, they go off and then blow me later on in the day, before I was cooking dinner in the evening, I'd go round to the Pizarro's, which is just round the corner from where I lived, and there's this bloke in there. I thought, oh, you look familiar, and there he was with a pint of Guinness. But I didn't really get to know him very well until the point where, in 2006, this idea of starting a seafood and wine festival down in Hastings, which I don't know how well you know the place, is a very lovely town by the sea. Lots of lovely sea views, lots of high deprivation, lots of social problems as well. And as part of the economic sort of development of the town, we decided to start this festival to try to attract people in to see how great it is. And we got the funding for it. And I walked into Pizarro's that night and said to the guy who ran it, because it's a seafood restaurant as well as a pub, oh, God, how am we going to do this? Because I've never run a festival before in my life, never done anything like that. And this head sort of looked up and said, well, if you need any help, I'm your man. I said, well, all right then. And what do you do? I don't know, because all I knew him as was this bloke who sort of I bumped into in the Old Town from time to time, who drank vast quantities of Guinness at the corner of the bar, but always on his own, as you say, either filling out a Sudoku or just reading a paper or whatever. And it turned out to be an extraordinarily fruitful relationship. I don't know what it ever was that he saw in me that made him devote quite so much of his free time, because as you've already pointed out, he used to travel so much on the train and work so hard. He didn't used to get into Pizarro's in the evening, often till about 8:30. And he decided that he was going to help develop this festival with us. And he gave up so much of his free time, never once asking for anything, although I do remember passing him a case of locally produced chapel down one day, and he said, oh, I'll try that this weekend with the steak. And he seemed to like it. But he always gave freely of his time. And I remember in 2007, he took actually 5 days leave from the TEC to work for nothing. And he was doing long hours. I would never have been able to organise that festival without him. It now attracts over 50,000 visitors a year. It's going to be taking place again in September. But he was without doubt someone who I could rely and absolutely trust down to the bone. No question about it. If I asked for something to be done, if I said, could you be there at 5 o'clock in the morning? Yeah, he was there. And never ever. And then he became more involved with other local projects that I was involved with, pilot markets in some of the areas of the town, the Jack in the Green Festival, which takes place shortly in May, and so on. He was involved with all of those things. And why did he do it? I honestly can't answer that question. He must have been working so hard during the week that but he managed to find time. He even got his son Owen involved with the Seafood and Wine Festival a few years ago, to give him some work experience. He always was pushing forward for me and helping out the town of Hastings, which does actually, frankly, need a lot of help. And he will be greatly missed. His organisational skills, his nice, warm, large arm round the shoulder when I was sort of pulling what remains of this out of my head, just saying, don't worry about it, buddy. It's going to be okay. Do you want another one of those? Yes, please. And I do remember the office issue. It came up, obviously, with me as well. I'm just popping over to the office, and 5 minutes later found him in the Dolphin pub, just directly opposite. He'll be greatly missed by me. He'll be greatly missed by the people of Hastings, and you know, the sort of work that he put in is the sort of thing that I think what Cameron aspires to with his big society, but is never going to come to fruition. I find myself, just to leave you with this, I actually am surprised that I find myself agreeing with the last sentence of Tony Blair's quote. He was, absolutely. And I must just say to Brendan, Nigel and Francis, who had to, at various times in their life, line manage him, I never identified with this recalcitrant beast, because I remember him walking up to me many times saying, "What do you want me to do next?" So he was there you go. Horses for courses and courses for horses. Anyway, here's the key. Cheers.
Thanks very much. Obviously, our mistake was paying him. So we're coming to the end now. But how do you sum up Keith? I mean, really, he was a man of contradictions. Really, one of the most individualist people I've ever met, but someone absolutely committed to the collective ideals of the trade union movement. I don't really do football, but I'm told he was a Manchester United supporter, but for years rarely missed a Tottenham game. It's a very easy way to get a reaction to football jokes, I find. He was the white van man who hated everything that white van men are meant to stand for. The rebel who was a stickler for the rules, the brilliant organiser whose desk was always a total mess. He loved Guinness and was allergic to garlic, unless it was in a curry, in which case his body somehow managed to cope with it. He hated ties, and you do notice we actually got to photograph him with a tie on. I think that was our biggest challenge for the evening. But he loved waistcoats. He liked boots, safety boots with steel toe caps, but always went round the office in bare feet, or at least his socks. He was fantastically respected by the Metropolitan Police, and indeed Tony Wright, who was the senior officer he worked with the most, can't be here tonight because he's cracked a rib in Abu Dhabi, but sent a lovely tribute which is up on the wall somewhere. I don't know what he was doing in Abu Dhabi either. But he was also respected by all the campaigning organisations like Amnesty International, who he helped, and I remember suddenly he was organising the Burma demonstration a few years ago. And he was really as much a part of the TUC as the Epstein statue out the window, but always the rebel. Now, it's very sad to realise that today would only have been his 63rd birthday. And I'm shortly going to ask Owen and Ryan to come and cut a birthday cake that we've prepared for him. we pondered long and hard about what piece of music to play at this point. Those at his funeral have known of his love for the Rolling Stones, but it wasn't all that he liked. He also liked Dick Gaughan, the great socialist Scottish folk singer. So we've compromised and we found Dick Gaughan actually singing a Rolling Stones song, which we thought was the kind of compromise that Keith would have given you one of those looks if you'd suggested. Anyway, I'm going to ask you now to raise your glasses and feel a bit inferior if it's not charged with red wine or Guinness. And drink a toast to Keith's memory, our colleague, our friend, and as Tony Wright said, one of nature's gentlemen. So Keith.